If you'd asked me a year earlier whether a single email could make me feel 17 again, I would have laughed. I was 30. After all, I had a job I respected, a son I adored, a husband who loved me without reservation. I had built a life so separate from my past that sometimes I could almost convince myself none of it had happened. Almost. But the past has a way of lurking, waiting for an unguarded moment to slip back in. And on that quiet April evening, it did. I was sitting at the dining table, the glow of my laptop illuminating my tea mug and the scattered notes I was reviewing for a campaign. Outside, twilight was softening the edges of the street below, lights blinking on one by one in the windows across the block. It was peaceful. Until my phone buzzed. I glanced over absently, expecting a work notification or maybe a message from David, who was putting Ethan to bed. Instead, I saw it, from Julia Bennett subject. Please read. I went perfectly still. My pulse began to throb in my ears, like a warning. 5 years. 5 years since I'd heard from my sister, or anyone else in my family. I hadn't realized until that moment how thoroughly I'd trained myself not to think about them. Not to picture Julia's bright smile or my mother's pale, appraising eyes. Not to replay the memory of the night everything shattered. But seeing her name, just 5 simple letters on a glowing screen, brought it all back. The engagement party. The betrayal. The cab ride to an empty apartment that no longer felt like home. I pressed the heel of my hand to my chest, as if I could physically push the memories back where they belonged. You don't have to read it, I told myself. I could swipe left, delete it, pretend it never came. I'd gotten good at pretending. But something, a stubborn kernel of curiosity or maybe the part of me that still wanted to believe people could be sorry, kept me rooted there. With a shaky finger, I tapped to open. Dear Michelle, I'm not sure you still check this email. I've tried everything else. Calls, messages to old friends, searching online. I'm pregnant. The baby shower is in 2 weeks at Mom and Dad's house. Everyone will be there, and we'd love for you to come. It's time you stopped hiding from us. Love. Julia. I read it twice. By the 3rd time, the words blurred behind a film of something hot and bitter. Hiding from us. As though it had been some childish tantrum. As though she hadn't stood up at my engagement party and calmly stolen everything I thought I'd built. My breath caught in my throat. I closed the email and set the phone face down. Across the table, my tea had gone cold. I used to love parties. When I was little, my mom threw elaborate birthday celebrations for us. Balloons, cake, all the neighbors' kids running in and out of the house. I'd stand beside Julia, who was always better at charming everyone. Even back then, she could hold a room in the palm of her hand. I never minded it much. I was quieter, happier observing from the edges. I'd always believed there was space for both of us. Until that night. I still remember exactly what I was wearing. A blue silk dress Ryan said brought out my eyes. A delicate necklace he'd given me for Christmas. I'd spent hours planning every detail. The menu. The music. The flowers. Everything had to be perfect, because it was the start of our life together. Or so I thought. The evening unfolded exactly the way I'd hoped. Our families mingled. Glasses clinked. Laughter rose and fell around me like music. I caught Julia's eye across the room once or twice. She smiled, but something about the way her gaze lingered made my stomach tighten. I told myself I was imagining it. That I was nervous. Overthinking. Then came the toasts. My father spoke first. His usual gruff sentimentality, saying he was proud of me. My mother followed, dabbing her eyes with a napkin. Then Ryan. His hand trembled a little as he lifted his glass. I can't wait to start this next chapter with you, he said, his voice soft. I felt my heart swell so full it almost hurt. And then it was Julia's turn. She stood slowly, smoothing her skirt. I remember how quiet it got. Like everyone sensed what was coming but me. She cleared her throat, looked right at me. I'm sorry, she began. her voice steady. "But I can't stand here and pretend this is right." A hush fell so absolute it seemed the walls themselves were listening. "I've been in love with Ryan for years," she said. "And he loves me." The air left my lungs. I felt like I'd been punched. I turned to Ryan, desperate for him to laugh, to deny it. But he didn't. He just looked at the floor, pale and trembling. When he finally spoke, his voice was ragged. "It's true," he said. "I didn't know how to tell you. But I want to be with Julia." I heard someone gasp, felt the room spin around me. My mother's hand came to her mouth. And me, I was frozen. For one impossible moment, I thought I would shatter right there on the spot. Instead, set down my glass. I walked past them all. My parents, Ryan, Julia, out the front door into the night. I called a cab with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. I remember watching the house shrink in the rearview mirror as we drove away. It felt like something final. Something I could never undo. The days after the engagement party passed in a kind of stunned quiet. I didn't answer the phone. Didn't open the door when anyone knocked. I couldn't. My world had collapsed, and there was no blueprint for how to build it again. When my mother finally got through, she didn't say what I needed to hear. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't say she was sorry. She just said, "You should make peace with Julia. It's what's best for everyone." And in that moment, something inside me broke clean through. I packed my life into boxes. I quit my job. I rented a storage unit for the things I couldn't bear to look at anymore. And then I left. It felt less like running away than stepping off a sinking ship. In the new city, I found a studio apartment. The first night there, I lay awake listening to the unfamiliar noises, the pipes, the wind against the old windows. And I knew, finally, that I was alone. But the strangest thing was the relief that came with it. Because alone meant no one else could hurt me. I thought healing would feel dramatic. Some triumphant moment when I'd stand on a mountaintop and declare I was over it all. But healing, I learned, was quieter. It looked like mundane choices. Getting up when my alarm rang. Making a cup of coffee even when I had no appetite. Unpacking one box each day so the apartment didn't feel like a holding cell. It was weeks before I stopped flinching every time my phone buzzed. Months before I deleted Ryan's number. Years before I stopped replaying Julia's words in my head. Some nights, I'd dream of the engagement party. I'd wake up gasping, the darkness pressing against my ribs like an accusation. But slowly, the dreams came less often. By the time winter arrived, I'd started to feel something I hadn't in a long time. Curiosity. About the city. About what came next. I walked everywhere, exploring little bookstores and coffee shops. It was the first time in my life no one knew my history. No one expected me to smile or perform. I could be anyone. It started in the most ordinary way. I was 27, 2 years into my job at the marketing agency. David was the new director. Calm, precise, unfailingly polite. Everyone liked him instantly. I was more cautious. I'd learned to be wary of men who seemed too good at charming a room. But he was different. He didn't flirt or boast. He listened. He remembered things. How I liked my coffee. That I preferred email to phone calls. That I always needed a moment to collect my thoughts before meetings. At first, we were just colleagues. He'd pass me in the hallway and offer a nod or a small smile. When we were assigned to the same project, we spent long hours in the conference room, drafting proposals. It was during one of those late evenings that I realized he made me feel safe. Not swept up or dazzled. Safe. One night, after a successful pitch, he offered to walk me home. It was only a few blocks, but I accepted. The air was crisp, the streetlights haloed in fog. We talked about everything but work. Books we loved, places we'd traveled, little details about our lives. I didn't tell him about the engagement party. About Julia. about how thoroughly I'd been broken. But I think he sensed there was a story I wasn't ready to share. And he never pushed. It took 6 months for me to admit I was falling for him. 6 months of quiet dinners, thoughtful conversations, and the slow realization that I could let my guard down without fear. When we finally kissed, it wasn't like anything I'd known before. Not frantic or breathless. Just gentle. Certain. Afterward, he pressed his forehead to mine and whispered, "You don't have to be afraid." And for the first time in years, I believed it. When I told him about Julia and Ryan, we were sitting on the couch in my apartment, the television playing some documentary neither of us was really watching. I'd been dreading it. I thought he'd look at me with pity, or worse, disbelief. Instead, he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he took my hand in both of his and held it. "You didn't deserve any of that," he said simply. Something in my chest eased. The night I discovered I was pregnant, I sat on the bathroom floor, my back against the cold tile. David found me there, the test in my shaking hands. He knelt and looked at me with the softest smile. "This is good," he murmured. "Is it?" "It's better than good." When he kissed me, I believed that too. We married in a quiet ceremony at City Hall. No guests except his parents, who hugged me as if I'd always been theirs. We didn't invite my family. I told myself it was because I didn't want the drama. But the truth was simpler. I hadn't forgiven them. And I didn't know if I ever would. The morning of my flight, I woke before dawn. I lay in bed, listening to David breathing beside me. The world still hushed and gray. Ethan's soft snoring came from the baby monitor, grounding me in the life I'd built. For a few minutes, I let myself imagine canceling the trip. I could email Julia, say something polite and vague. I could choose not to open old wounds. But I knew I wouldn't. I needed to see them, even if only to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid anymore. The drive to the airport felt surreal. David reached over and held my hand on the console. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I do," I whispered. He didn't argue. He just squeezed my hand until we pulled up to the curb. "I love you," he murmured against my hair. I held on to that as I walked into the terminal, as I boarded the plane, as the engines roared to life. The past felt impossibly close. I couldn't help wondering what they would say when they saw me. Or if they'd say anything at all. When the cab pulled up in front of my parents' house, I sat for a moment, staring up at the porch light. Nothing had changed. The same cracked driveway. The same white siding. But I had changed. I was no longer the woman who ran away in the dark. I paid the driver and walked up the path, each step deliberate. At the door, I hesitated only once before pressing the bell. A long pause. Then the door opened, and there she was. My mother. Her hair was still that same pale blonde, though now it seemed more brittle. Her eyes went wide, and for a heartbeat, she looked like she didn't recognize me. "Michelle," she whispered. I forced a smile. "Hi, Mom. I got Julia's invitation." Her mouth opened and closed, as if she were searching for something to say. Finally, she stepped aside. "Come in." The moment I crossed the threshold, the chatter died. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward me. I felt them taking in every detail. My hair, my clothes, the faint lines at the corners of my eyes. Aunt Debbie was the first to speak. "She's changed so much," she said to no one in particular, her voice carrying. My father came out of the kitchen, a red plastic cup in hand. "Michelle?" he asked, blinking as if he'd seen a ghost. I nodded. "Hello, Dad." I didn't hug him. Didn't hug any of them. My gaze scanned the room until it landed on Julia. She stood near the fireplace, her belly round under a blue dress. Her face brightened in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Michelle, you made it." She walked toward me, hand resting on her stomach like a shield. "So glad you're here." she said, her voice warm and brittle all at once. I knew you'd come alone. I swallowed. Nice to see you, too. I barely had time to draw a breath before Aunt Debbie swept over. Michelle, dear, she said, patting my arm. I had 3 children by the time I was your age. You know, the clock is ticking. My mother joined in, her mouth pursing. Julia's about to be a mother. And you're still. Well, you're not getting younger. I felt the old humiliation rising like bile. But this time, I held my ground. I'm exactly where I'm meant to be, I said. Tara, my cousin, pulled me aside. You need to get over it, she hissed. It was 5 years ago. I looked her straight in the eye. You weren't there, I replied. You didn't hear her say it. You didn't watch him agree. Her mouth pressed into a thin line. She had no answer for that. Finally, Julia approached again, her hand brushing my arm as if we were old friends. I really am glad you came, she said. I studied her carefully. She looked tired, older than I remembered. But her eyes still held that same gleam, like she was winning something I didn't understand. I reached into my bag and pulled out a wrapped box. For you, I said. She peeled back the paper, revealing a set of expensive baby blankets. Oh, she murmured, her expression pinching. I'm happy for you both, I said, my tone just sharp enough that only she would hear it. You deserve each other. Her mouth tightened. But before she could reply, there was a knock at the door. I watched my mother open it, her voice floating through the hush. I'm sorry. I think you have the wrong house. No, came a warm, steady voice I knew better than my own heartbeat. I'm here for Michelle. The room went silent. I turned, and there he was, David, holding Ethan's small hand. My heart kicked against my ribs. David's gaze found mine, and he smiled. My mother looked from him to me, her mouth opening and closing. Your husband. I walked forward, my steps steady. Yes, I said. This is David, and this is our son, Ethan. The silence broke all at once. Voices erupted. Questions. Exclamations. Julia's face drained of color as Ethan clambered into my arms. David moved to stand beside me, his hand warm against my back. And for the first time since I'd stepped into that house, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. For the next hour, the living room churned with a current of voices. People I hadn't spoken to in years crowded around David, bombarding him with questions. How long had we been married? Where did we live? Why hadn't we told anyone? David answered calmly, one hand resting protectively on my waist. Ethan, perched on my hip, studied every new face with wide, solemn eyes. Julia stood back, her arms crossed over her belly, watching with a tight mouth as attention slipped away from her. I tried not to feel petty satisfaction, but I'd be lying if I said it wasn't there. My mother drifted closer, her gaze fixed on Ethan. He's beautiful, she said softly. Her voice trembled. I looked down at my son. His hair had dried in soft curls, and he clutched the little stuffed lion David had given him when he was born. I pressed a kiss to the top of his head. He is. I agreed. Why didn't you tell us? She whispered. I turned to her, feeling years of hurt settle heavy in my chest. You were too busy telling me to forgive the people who betrayed me, I said evenly. You didn't care how much it cost me. Tears welled in her eyes. We just wanted you to move on. And I did, I said. But not in the way you meant. David caught my gaze and tilted his head, silently asking if I was ready to leave. But I wasn't. Not yet. I needed to finish this, to say what I'd carried for half a decade. I turned to Julia. She lifted her chin, her mouth tightening. You did this on purpose, she hissed when we were close enough that no one else could hear. You came here to humiliate me. I studied her face. The dark circles under her eyes. The strain in her voice. It struck me. In that moment, that she wasn't as certain of herself as she once had been. "No," I said quietly. "I came here to show you I survived." Her mouth opened, then closed again. She looked away. When we finally gathered our things to leave, my parents followed us to the door. "Please," my mother said, her hand brushing my arm. "Can we at least have your number? Your address?" Ethan shifted in my hold, sleepy and warm. David placed a reassuring hand on my back. I met my mother's gaze and shook my head. "I'm not ready," I said. "Maybe I never will be." My father looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. He just lowered his eyes. Outside, the evening air was cool against my flushed cheeks. We walked to the car in silence. David buckled Ethan into his car seat, then turned to me. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. I nodded, though my chest felt raw. "I am," I said. And it was true. For the first time since that night 5 years earlier, I felt something like peace. As David pulled away from the house, I looked back only once. Julia stood framed in the doorway, her hands resting on her belly. For a single heartbeat, our eyes met. Something flickered there. Regret? Longing? I didn't know. And I didn't wait to find out. We flew home the next morning. On the plane, David held my hand while Ethan dozed against my shoulder. I watched the clouds slide past the window, feeling lighter than I had in years. I'd braced myself for that trip to shatter me. Instead, it had shown me that I wasn't the same woman who had fled in the dark. I had built something strong. Something they couldn't touch. The first weeks after we returned were quiet. I waited for the emails, the phone calls, for the desperate apologies or the angry accusations. They came, of course. One by one, my parents and Julia reached out. Some messages were contrite, some defensive. I didn't answer any of them. Not at first. I read each one, then set it aside. It felt strangely empowering to know that I could choose whether to respond, and that either way, my life would go on. As spring turned to summer, I began to think more often about forgiveness. Not for them, but for me. I wanted to be free of the anger. Free of the old wounds that still itched when I least expected it. One Saturday morning, I stood at the kitchen counter, watching Ethan build towers of blocks. David came up behind me, resting his hands on my shoulders. "You're far away," he said quietly. I leaned back against him. "Just thinking. About them." I nodded. "About what comes next." His thumb traced a slow circle against my collarbone. "There's no rush," he said. And in that moment, I believed him. It was October when it happened. David had taken Ethan to the park. I was folding laundry when the doorbell rang. I opened it without thinking. And there they were. My parents. They looked older than I remembered. Smaller, somehow. As though time had pressed them down. "Michelle," my mother began, her voice hoarse. I didn't step aside. "How did you find me?" Her eyes filled with tears. "We needed to see you," she whispered. Dad cleared his throat. "Your sister had her baby," he said. Mom pulled out her phone, showing me a photo of a tiny newborn wrapped in a pink blanket. "Her name is Emma." My chest tightened. They waited for me to say something. Anything. But I couldn't. Finally, my mother looked past me into the house. "Can we come in?" I shook my head. "There's a cafe down the street," I said. "We can talk there." Her face fell. But she didn't argue. The cafe was half empty, the late morning sun slanting across the tables. I chose a corner booth, as far from the other customers as possible. We sat, the silence between us stretching long and taut. Finally, my mother spoke. "We're sorry," she said, her hands twisting around her cup. Her voice cracked. "We should have been there for you." I looked at her, at the lined face that had once seemed so unyielding. "When Julia betrayed me," I said, my own voice low, "you chose her." over and over again. My father flinched. "We thought we were doing the right thing," he said gruffly. "We wanted you to move on. You wanted me to disappear," I corrected. No one spoke for a long moment. Finally, my mother reached across the table. Her hand hovered over mine. "Can we try again?" she asked, tears slipping free. "Can we be part of your life?" I thought of Ethan, of David, of the peace we had made for ourselves, and I knew the answer. "Not yet," I said gently. "Maybe not ever." Her mouth trembled, but she nodded. 2 weeks later, the doorbell rang again. This time, it was Julia. She stood on the porch, her baby in her arms. Her eyes were ringed with exhaustion. "Surprise," she said weakly. I didn't invite her in, but I didn't close the door, either. She shifted Emma higher on her hip. "I know I should have called," she said, "but I was afraid you wouldn't answer." "You were right," I said simply. Her shoulders sagged. "Can we talk?" After a moment, I stepped back and let her inside. We sat in the living room. Emma fussed softly in her lap. Julia looked around, taking in the framed photos, the little toys scattered across the rug. "You built a beautiful life," she said quietly. I didn't answer. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," she continued. Her voice was raw, stripped of all its old certainty. "What I did to you, I can't take it back." "No," I agreed. She swallowed. "But I hope someday you'll let Emma know you." I looked at the baby, her tiny fists waving in the air. She didn't deserve the mess we'd made. "Maybe," I said finally. "Someday." That night, after Julia left, I sat with David on the back porch. The sky was a deep, endless blue. Ethan slept upstairs. I leaned my head on David's shoulder. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. I closed my eyes. "That I don't want to be angry anymore." His arm tightened around me. "You don't have to forgive them." "I know," I said. "But maybe I can forgive myself." 3 months later, Olivia Grace was born. A dark-haired, wailing miracle. David's parents came to help. They brought flowers, casseroles, gentle hands to rock the baby. The house was full of warmth, of belonging. When we came home from the hospital, there was a package waiting on the porch. Inside was a hand-knitted baby blanket. And a card. "Congratulations. We're here when you're ready. Love, Mom and Dad." I sat on the couch, the blanket folded across my lap. My heart was a tangled ache of memories and something that felt almost like hope. I didn't call them. Not right away. But that evening, as I rocked Olivia to sleep, I thought about the girl I'd been, the one who ran out of her own engagement party, her heart in shreds. She wouldn't have believed this life was waiting on the other side. Love, peace, the power to choose her own ending. I kissed Olivia's downy head. And I knew. The greatest revenge wasn't shutting them out forever. It was building a life so full and bright that their absence was no longer a wound. And then, when I was ready, if I was ever ready, deciding on my own terms whether to let them witness it,